Hello and welcome to this very special event, which is coming to you live from a very cold winter evening in Cambridge. It's dark outside. I don't know where you're joining us from, but I hope you are warm and comfortable where you are. It's a real pleasure to be running this event today. It's Optima Live. It links to our most recent publication of Optima, which went live, including on our website recently. And I hope people on the on this event have had a chance to look at it. But if not, maybe Nicola, it's worth sharing a link in the chat so that people have access to Optima, which is available to read online as well. Optima is the annual Fitzwilliam College magazine. It is an opportunity for staff, students, academic staff to share some of the work that they're doing. And it had a particular focus on sustainability issues broadly defined this year. So we thought it would be a nice opportunity for us to pick up on some of the articles that were featured in Optima. And it's a great pleasure to be joined by a number of the people who were featured in this issue. I'm Bhaskar Veera. I'm a graduate tutor at Fitzwilliam. I'm also Director of Studies in Geography. And I was, if you looked really hard, I was visible at the back of the magazine. I will be talking a little bit about my contribution, but it's really an opportunity for me to anchor a discussion with a few of the other contributors to the magazine and to try and draw out some common themes and for us to collectively reflect on the state of the planet, the state of sustainability in context of recent events, including the Conference of the Parties to the Climate Change Convention, which recently concluded in Glasgow, which makes a lot of this very topical. So the plan is for us to talk very briefly about our short pieces in Optima, and I'll lead us through that conversation, and then for us to have an open conversation across those who are on the call, as well as those who contributed to Optima. And then to look ahead and think about what happens next. So it's an opportunity to update on what's happened in the months since Optima went live, since the copy went to the printers, because things are moving quite rapidly in some of these areas. And I hope we'll have a chance to think about some of that as well. So we hope to finish by 7 UK time. So let me start very briefly with a reflection on my own piece. And my own piece really picked up on themes of environmental activism, but I want to place environmental activism of today in a much longer history of activism and social action. And I was very fortunate during my PhD in the early 1990s to work in the Himalayas with community leaders who'd been in the forefront of an environmental activist movement called Chipko. Chipko means to hug, literally to hug trees. And the movement was very famous in the 1970s because groups of villagers surrounded their village forest and prevented commercial exploitation of those forests by those who were determined to cut them down. It's very famous as one of the most original and powerful grassroots environmental movements. And I've had the opportunity to spend some time in the villages where Chipko was centered during the early 1990s and to talk to some of the activists. What was fascinating about what happened there was that the grassroots activism was combined with the use of the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court issued a ban on all commercial felling of timber in the Himalayas, which has led to a considerable improvement in the green cover of the Himalayan ranges. And it exemplified the importance of combining grassroots activism with formal policy negotiation processes. So coming to our present day, I think what I was trying to reflect on in the article was the importance of these varied forms of environmental engagement. And civil action, civil disobedience, as it's sometimes called, has a long history beyond environmental activism. So I invoke in the piece the traditions of people like Gandhi, of people like Martin Luther King, of people like Nelson Mandela, who are all activists in their own right. And their civil disobedience was designed to create discomfort. So with reluctance, I have to accept that, sometimes activists make our lives uncomfortable because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get us to sit up and pay attention to the causes that they're trying to reflect. So I might come across in the article as somewhat more sympathetic to some of that disruption than perhaps colleagues might like, because if you're stuck on the M25 because somebody's decided to block the motorway, that's not a nice or happy place to be. But the activists who are blocking the M25 are precisely doing it so that we stop and take notice and force a policy discussion about some of the issues that they're interested in bringing to our attention. But often the kind of detail lies in the negotiation process that takes place behind closed doors, not on the street, not on the M25. So it's that combination of street pressure and quiet negotiation that gets things done. And that's really what I'm reflecting on in my little piece. And I'd be really happy to talk more about this. What did I think about COP26? I thought it was so visible that you had the inside and the outside of the conference. So much of the media was looking at the conference from the outside, but there was a lot of very detailed negotiation, line by line, draft after draft being negotiated within the negotiating parties. And the outcomes of the conference are going to be determined both by the pressures of activists on the outside and by the details that governments are able to negotiate amongst themselves on the inside. So I think COP really very beautifully illustrated some of those, the juxtaposition of those two forms of activism. Let me move on. David, you're next on my list, and you and Keshav are both here, and you wrote a really interesting, or your piece really reflects on some of the action that was happening at COP, which is the importance of land use, land cover, trees as a way to mitigate some of the worst impacts of climate change. And more importantly, so much of the COP conversation was about transparency, about how governments and others who are making commitments can be made to offer credible ways in which their commitments can be monitored, so that the changes are actually real changes that improve our trajectories towards what we're hoping will be net zero in 2050. So, but you're launching some really interesting work. So let me hand over to you, and why don't you briefly summarize your piece?
Well, thanks very much, Bhaskar, and it was a pleasure to be involved in this important issue of Optima, and thanks to those who helped write the article with Keshav and myself. And so the context here is that I think there's some room for optimism in terms of curbing the loss of biodiversity around the planet, and including in the UK, and that's because of various factors. In the UK, our departure from the EU means that the Common Agricultural Policy, which has supported farmers for a long time, is slowly being unwound over the next 7 years, and a new system for subsidising and incentivising farmers is coming in place, and the government has signalled its intention to build opportunities for nature, as well as supporting livelihoods in the UK. And so we know that's going to be very complicated because we've got competing land uses across the UK, and planting 30,000 new hectares of woodland a year, as the government's committed to, is going to be difficult in a crowded isle. And the only way we can achieve these objectives is to think in a truly interdisciplinary way. So in that context, it's been wonderful to start working with Keshav, and Keshav is online with us and might want to chip in a moment, in a particular project which we've called the Cambridge Centre for Carbon Credits. And what this is about is working out a trustworthy marketplace for developing a trustworthy marketplace for trading carbon credits produced from nature-based solutions. So those nature-based solutions could include protecting forests, could be planting forests, protecting peatlands around the world. And we know that these measures are really effective at drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and protecting existing carbon stored in nature. And so if we can find financial mechanisms to support those activities, that can really help both climate change mitigation, but also protecting biodiversity and helping local livelihoods if we do it all right. But the mechanism for doing that is complicated, and there's been 15 years of work trying to come up with sound, trustworthy methodologies for working out how much carbon is being saved by particular projects around the world, and providing financial mechanisms to support those projects. So that's where this new initiative comes in. It's a collaboration between myself, a plant scientist interested in remote sensing technologies, Keshav Srinivasan and Neil Madhavapedi from the Computer Lab, fantastic working with them, Tom Swinfield and Andrew Barnford from Zoology. And Andrew Barnford has a long history of working with the economics of nature-based solutions. And so together we're working on a new project, which is the development of algorithms which underpin a trustworthy marketplace for carbon credits. I might hand over to Keshav to say a few words at this point if he wishes to.
Thank you, David. I'll keep it very brief. So as David mentioned, this is a collaboration, and I'm not an expert in anything that David talked about. I hardly know anything about forest science or ecology or environment, but the underlying issues of large-scale data management, of data analysis, interpretation, and trustworthiness are issues that computer science is uniquely positioned to deal with. And what is wonderful is to use computer science for something for good rather than selling you more advertising, as Google does. As somebody said, the best minds of our generation are focused on selling you advertising, and that's terrible. So we'd like to use those same best minds to do something more positive. And so many of the technologies that have been pioneered in other contexts I think can be refactored, retooled for this, and we look forward to I look forward to working on this together and to actually bring other computer scientists into this, because there is a lot to be done. Thank you.
And as for the COP26, there was commitments from 100 nations to curb deforestation by 2030 and $20 billion of investments on the table in that front, in that regard. So I think there are real opportunities in this space, and Keshav and I have already been talking to many people in the financial sector about how this centre could be beneficial for protecting forests.
Thank you, David. And I should have introduced you earlier, but that was Professor David Coombs, who's Professor of the Department of Plant Sciences and Director of the Cambridge Conservation Research Institute, and Professor Srinivasan Keshav, who is Robert Sansom Professor at the Computer Lab here in Cambridge, who are collaborating together on this exciting new initiative, and of course, both fellows of the college. You talked about the brightest minds, and I think it's time for us to move to a couple of them. It's fantastic to have Ellie Wilding, who's a PhD student now in plant sciences, having done her master's previously in geography. And Ellie's working on grasslands and forest and savanna ecosystems in various parts of the world for her PhD. She has just been completing her first stint of PhD fieldwork, but wrote about some of her other work, as well as the really difficult circumstances of fieldwork being cancelled because of COVID, which has been something which has disrupted so many students' abilities to go out into these ecosystems, which are so important. It's really fascinating to sort of contrast the different ways in which we collect data. And certainly the work that David and Keshav are leading relies on so much of the technological advancements that allow remote data collection, but really coupling that with data collection in the field is such a critical part of trying to really understand environmental change. So Ellie, you're out there doing it. So tell us more about your work and your piece.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Bhaskar. That was, I'm not sure I consider myself one of the greatest minds, but that's very kind of you. Yeah, so my PhD is really looking at, currently looking at fire and how this affects soil carbon responses to changing fire regimes. And a lot of this is, as Bhaskar said, focused in savanna systems and open ecosystems. And this is, again, kind of been molded by COVID and has recently kind of got me really interested in the heathlands in Cornwall and how they're burnt regularly, and essentially kind of what the impacts of that are on the soil carbon responses to the ecosystem. And what we've kind of found in a lot of studies, and my year to date has been working on a meta-analysis to trying to understand this a bit better whilst I've been unable to get to the field. But what I really want to try and understand is what the underlying mechanisms that drive the soil carbon response to fire are, so that we can understand how these ecosystems, which are regularly burned and which are kind of have naturally always been on fire, are kind of sort of interacting with the greater global carbon cycle. So yeah, as Bhaskar said, I've recently come back from the field in Cornwall, lugging 18 stone of soil over cliffs, and the saving grace was that it was by the sea with lots of good bird life. Yeah, slightly kind of less glamorous than than I think I often hope field work might be, but it's been amazing to get out in the field, and it's such an important component of my research to have this observational data to really kind of match up with some of the remote sensing and satellite research that's going on in my lab group. And yeah, my piece in Optima also focused a little bit on my MPhil, which was looking at seagrass and carbon. So yeah, carbon in a different type of grass, an underwater grass. And again, that was very COVID affected, but it was kind of, it was made to work through a lot of really good data that's online with the National University of Singapore. So yeah, it would be great to kind of see how that project continues within Singapore with the links that we made there. But.
Thank you, Ellie. And thinking about the disruptions that COVID has had, I think, the undergraduate community has been particularly impacted, and our third year students have lived through 2 years out of their 3 of pandemic. And we have with us Rosie Rice, who's a third year geographer. So she arrived 2 years and a bit ago, and 6 months into her first year was thrown into lockdown. And really, we only emerged from that sometime over the summer. Picking up on the theme of fieldwork, fieldwork can be planned and fieldwork can be accidental, shall we say. And Rosie was doing a piece of planned work in the Canary Islands in early September, when a volcano decided to erupt right next to her. And she is a committed, keen, passionate volcanologist. It was a dream come true to be where she was in some ways, but also very challenging, because you're suddenly experiencing in first person some of the things that you've been reading about in the abstract pages of textbooks. I think every volcanologist on the planet wanted to be where Rosie was, and she was right there in the hotspot. So Rosie, tell us about your time and your reflections on fieldwork in Tenerife.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I was out in Tenerife for all of September doing an internship with a company called Tenerife. So the kind of purpose of that internship was we had science communication training, which luckily came in very handy a few weeks down the line. But we also did a lot of field work in Tenerife. And again, it was just so great to finally be able to, get up close to things I'd only studied about until now, and to be able to kind of pick up rocks and touch things in the field that I'd only learned about in textbooks was just absolutely incredible. So in the 4th week of my internship, as Bhaskar said, an eruption happened on a neighboring island of La Palma. And I think the week before that, we'd done like a practice eruption reporting exercise. So again, that came in quite handy. So I was up in the national park in the last week of my internship, and I managed to get a glimpse of the plume through a pair of binoculars. And for me, that just wasn't enough. I decided there and then, whatever happens, whatever the plan is, I have to get over there. So kind of what ensued was, sitting on hold to Jet 2 for quite a few hours, trying to change my flights, kind of trying to throw together some sort of a plan. But we all just kind of knew that, we couldn't plan. We had to expect the unexpected. And I kind of, got on that ferry to La Palma not knowing what was going to happen on the other side. So we left on the 25th of September, so around 6 days after the eruption started. So we kind of rushed onto the ferry, rushed down to the port. And when we got there wasn't really many signs of an eruption, apart from there was kind of emergency personnel on the ferry, at the port, there was kind of TV cameras. And then we went to go get our rental car, and there was a very kind of thin layer of ash on the rental car. And that was kind of our first, almost calm introduction to what would, later become this volcanic beast that we'd have to learn to live with. So that first day was just such a roller coaster of emotions, because, as Bhaskar said, this is every volcanologist's dream. And I, never dreamt I'd get to see an eruption as an undergraduate. So we were almost like little kids in a sweet shop, like running around the island, trying to get the best view. And hearing that eruption for the first time, it's a sound that I just, I can't describe it. And we were all just stood there, all volcano enthusiasts, big volcano nerds, just kind of stood there with our hands on our heads. And it was almost like we were pilgrims on a pilgrimage, and that was our church. Like, no one spoke, and we were just completely, enhanced in this eruption that was going on. And as night fell, it kind of just fully came to life, and it was almost like, nature's firework display. And then as the week went on, we got involved in a lot of like the media side of it. So we wanted to accurately report on the eruption. So I kind of put to practice, all of the SciComm skills that I learned earlier on. I tweeted a lot about the eruption. I was then later kind of thrown into radio interviews, TV interviews, which is something that, I was never prepared for. And in the midst of all of that, I also changed my dissertation topic the night before we left. So yes, fieldwork is sometimes accidental. I kind of found myself in this situation. I just decided, this kind of feels like a dissertation on a plate. So I've now decided to look at the road of memory of the 1971 eruption in the response to this eruption, because they are incredibly different. So yeah, what was kind of, my biggest takeaway was definitely the social side of the eruption. And that's what I kind of felt most affected by. So as I said, when we first got there, we were, so excited and just so kind of like little kids. And then by the end of it, it was, like we really just wanted it to end, because every single day we'd see the lava flow advance and destroy homes. We'd had someone come up to us to ask to borrow binoculars to check if their house had been destroyed. There was a woman that, burst into tears next to me, and I speak no Spanish whatsoever. So the most I could offer was a tissue or a hug. So the social side of it, the human side of it, was something that kind of really affected me, and was something that I felt like I had to share via social media and make sure that the people of the eruption weren't forgotten. So the eruption in La Palma is still ongoing. It's at the moment shown no signs of stopping. There's been a recent lava flow in the past few days that's created a new entrance and a new bit of land to the sea. That's again destroyed further homes, and very sadly, and this is something that I didn't even think of, I saw that the lava flow has actually kind of now covered a cemetery. So somewhere that's such an important place for people is now completely gone and destroyed. And it really kind of brings to the forefront that social side of the eruption. So if you're wondering, what can we do to help in this situation, it's definitely, since coming back, a position that I found myself in, almost feeling a bit helpless, kind of being in Cambridge and wanting, to get back over there and help. So I did a talk in the auditorium that a lot of geographers came to, and FITS people came to, and I managed to raise over £300. So I'm working closely with Tenerife, who have set up a GoFundMe. And they're working directly with 4 different families on the ground. They're over there right now, handing out that money that I raised. So they have a GoFundMe set up. I think it's linked in the Optima piece. So if you'd like to, if you want to help, this is a great way to directly help families, because that government aid kind of takes quite a while to trickle down.
Thank you, Rosie. And that's a fantastic example of, just converting some of the values that we hold so dear into actual action, and being able to provide direct support to the families who have been so immediately impacted. And some of those values, I think, were reflected in the final piece that we're going to turn to from our bursar. And I started the conversation, Rod, today with talking about activism. And sometime over the summer, over the last few months, I would probably have called you an activist bursar, because in revising our sustainable investment policy, which you wrote about, I thought you were leading the students rather than them leading you. So why don't you tell us about the process that led to this very progressive and far-thinking revised investment policy?
Thanks, Bhaskar. And I think the community, all elements of the community, were driving the policy. I just briefly want to touch on 3 areas. One is, why did we decide to change the policy? What have we put in place, and what do we hope to achieve from it? So firstly, why did we put our policy in place? Well, it was driven by a number of things. One is that, FITS, as I touched on a moment ago, I think the whole community has a commitment to environmentalism and social responsibility. It's kind of one of our core values. It's in our DNA. And I think that commitment for me was expressed by the discussions that we had as part of the strategic review early on in the year. The colleges spent the last 12 months having discussions across the college communities. That's students, academics, members of staff and alumni, to just understand, firstly, to reconfirm what our values are, and then understand what our ambition is in terms of the college and what we want to achieve into the medium term. And it wasn't therefore surprising that the environment was at the heart of our strategic plan that came out of that process, and very much in relation to that, what our position was in terms of our investment policy. So that was a key factor. But I think there's another feature as well, because although our previous sustainable investment policy had only been introduced at the end of 19, and the college community had had a very long conversation about what it was we wanted to introduce, within just a year, other entities within Cambridge, the university and other colleges, had made significant steps, so that when we looked at our policy, it felt a little stale. It felt as if we were a little behind the curve. And I think those 2 things drove our decision to look again at the policy and see whether or not we could move forward and make a material step. So just looking, what have we put in place? Well, we're not a significant college in terms of our investments. We're very modest. Some people say we're poor, and in the context of Cambridge colleges, you could say we are. So we have about 50 million in investment in our investment portfolio, and that's the element which our new policy impacts. And what the policy's done, really, it's a significant step that we've made. What we've hoped to achieve is actually we've set the bar for other entities within Cambridge, other colleges and so forth, to actually have an ambition to kind of move that bar further. And we've done that across, not just in terms of tightening the criteria in terms of our investment in fossil fuels and electricity generation, where anything with revenues of greater than 10% in those activities, we will not invest in any shape or form. But we've also covered tobacco and defence weapon manufacturers as well. So that's quite a material step for us. And not only that, we've committed to measure those investments against the leading ESG rating and review that on an annual basis. And the other point I would make is that actually we've tried to go one step further, which is actually not just about our investments, but about the relationships that we have with those financial institutions who we deal with. And what we've basically said very publicly is that they need to align themselves to our values, because if not, we will take actions to step away from that relationship. And I think that's just as important as some of the tangible things I've set out in terms of our targets. So, what are we hoping to achieve from it? Well, at one level, what we're hoping to achieve is actually we want to demonstrate that our investing is not just about a financial return or a value for money. It's actually about our social responsibility, and it's that intangible social return that we want to achieve. And that goes to the heart of climate change and how we address climate change. But on a broader basis, I think what it's acted as being is like a catalyst for us to reinvigorate our efforts across the whole college community around sustainability. So we've committed to write a new sustainable strategy over the course of the next 12 months. I have become chair of the Environment Committee, and that's a demonstration that the man with the money or the purse strings is committed to basically making sure that every element of the college's activity has an environmental component to it. And then the final point is that we will continue to do all the great things that we have done, so be them small or large. And actually what we're hoping to do is just coordinate that in a much more effective way going forward. So I think it's a great step, and it's fortuitous that it combined with COP and the fact that basically we were able to bring that together as part of the Optima issue.
Thanks, Rod. And thank you to all of the participants for your contributions today, as well as your contributions to Optima. And obviously, please do read the articles for more detail on the work that people have been talking about. I wanted to just pick up on the role of the college, really, as a kind of place where some of these ideas get fostered and nurtured. And Rod, you've talked about the wider community, but maybe I could draw David in, because I know that lunch played quite an important role as you and Keshav were discussing your ideas for this new centers. And I suppose one of the things that people continually comment on is that the opportunity to interact with people from outside of your specialist area, the opportunity to share ideas with each other and to learn from each other is such a important part of the collegiate experience. And I certainly saw the two of you nattering away, and from that, great things have come. So, what would you say the kind of collegiate environment offers in that context?
I think it offers really excellent puddings, and puddings make the world go round. Yeah, so I completely agree that those conversations over lunch, over puddings, are immensely fruitful. We all sit in our offices doing our working on our own expert topics throughout the day, but actually having a chance to get together, sometimes with a plan in mind, but often just a conversation, exploring what other people are doing is just wonderful. It's what makes Cambridge special, I think. I've worked in other places where we haven't got these opportunities, and you don't come out of your box and have the opportunities to chat with other people about exciting research they're doing.
David, you talked about your conversations with the finance sector, and of course, the work that you and Keshav are doing now is right at the center of these incredible commitments that governments have made. As you said, over 100 governments have committed to reversing deforestation by 2030. And that's a really urgent and important agenda, but also a very ambitious agenda, which will need all the help that can be provided. But it suddenly means that you have to have conversations in languages that are not necessarily the languages of the science lab. And this question of science communication, I think Rosie touched upon, the internship that she was doing in the summer was actually about exposing students to the value of science communication. And people in your worlds, I'm looking at Rosie and Ellie now, increasingly the modern communicator has to use all the tools in your arsenal, as it were. It's not just writing scientific papers which sit on a bookshelf, which very few people might read, but about the world of Twitter and Instagram and YouTube, and you need to be up with all of those. And Rosie, I know you've kind of experienced it firsthand, suddenly being thrust live on TV and being asked a question. It's a difficult position to be in. So maybe reflect on that. What is the importance? You said that science communication is a career opportunity for you. What do you think that actually means?
So I think what became increasingly clear as we were kind of on the ground, and also kind of before we even set up after Palma, we were following this eruption on Twitter straight away, and that seemed to be the way it was being communicated. So yeah, what became increasingly kind of important to us is that the need for accurate information to be reported during this type of situation, but also immediately. We live in a world now where there's a 24-hour news cycle, and so things like newspapers to get out that there's been an eruption. The eruption that I'm studying for my dissertation was in 1971. So kind of the contrast between how that was communicated and how this has been communicated has been starkly different. So kind of as, a young scientist and someone that had been trained on science communication, kind of going into this eruption, it was incredibly important for me to actually report on this, but also in English, because a lot of the reporting on it had been in Spanish, and there's a lot of tourists in La Palma, in the Canary Islands, and so yeah, it was kind of mainly to put to bed a lot of the sensationalism that was going on. There was kind of a lot of different theories based on the eruption of La Palma that we were being asked about, and yeah, I was just so grateful that I kind of had those 2 weeks of science communication training, because kind of as a geographer and as someone who's learned about volcanic hazards, volcanic risk, and nothing, firstly quite prepares you for living on the page of a textbook, but then, having to communicate that not in an essay, but in a tweet where you're limited to characters, it was just, incredibly different. And that's why, to bring this back to COP26, I think Twitter is an incredible tool for scientists to use, because it really forces you to, think about what are the main points that I want to get out here. You can't use jargon, you have to kind of explain it in lay terms. So I think, it's this incredible tool to communicate with the public, because, it has its upsides, that it allows you to reach loads of people. It gives everyone an opinion. So being able to have those conversations openly on Twitter, I think increasingly it's becoming, this great tool that I think should be utilized. And the person that delivered our science communication training actually gave a training program to some of the scientists from universities heading to COP. So yeah, I kind of think having that training is incredibly important.
Ellie, you're in the middle of a PhD program that's funded by the National Environment Research Council, and the Doctoral Training Partnership puts a lot of emphasis on training. So, to what extent do you spend time on sort of, learning these modern tools? I mean, and how important is it for your cohort of PhD students to be, as Rosie is saying, able to use these communication tools to get news about your paper out, or news about the research that you're doing? Is it something that's becoming increasingly important in your world?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that really what kind of science communication is about is bridging the gap between the scientists and the people who kind of need to understand the science, which is everyone, and trying to kind of make it sort of understandable and relatable. And I think that science communication, where you're forced to kind of, particularly on things like Twitter, where you're forced to really kind of push a lot of information into a set number of characters, forces you to think about the value of the message that you're sending. And all of a sudden, sort of a lot of the contextual information becomes less important as you just really focus on that key message. And I think that is what is really valuable about science communication. And also, we live in a very kind of instant world at the moment. We expect things to happen immediately, and as Rosie said, there's this 24 hours news cycle, and actually kind of as you're scrolling through and you see a tweet, that can often have far more of an impact than seeing a headline and thinking you should read this article, but actually never getting around to it. But yeah, and within the DTP, the science communication is a really big part of it. And there's things such as the Cambridge Science Festival that we all get trained for. And I think that when you look at conservation kind of outside the world of academia as well, that's really what gets people funding. You know, I worked at Kew Gardens and we had to do a lot of live TV interviews because that's what gets people interested. That's what gets people engaged. And that's what kind of draws the money in to do the important science.
Thanks. And you know, I mean, communication is a theme that's really important. The Bursa yesterday had the challenging task of presenting really complex financial information to the governing body in 10 minutes. And, you know, it's really difficult to get across some of these ideas without having clarity of you know, focus on the key points and get them across in an accessible way. So I think we can all benefit collectively. And maybe that's one of the things that the college could be spending more of our time doing collectively. And, you know, we have now a dedicated communications director, which is fantastic because, you know, we are paying attention to the importance of talking outside of the narrow confines or the ivory towers that we are, you know, reputed to be inhabiting. So I think this is definitely moving in the right direction, in spirit of which I think I should turn to the audience, which has been very kind of patient and listening to us, and ask you to, I have one hand up, but I have also noticed that there's a particular question for you, Ellie, if you could kind of turn to that first. And it's Jeff Harvey who's asking about forest fires. And is there an opportunity here for them to have some long-term positive impact because they can turn some of the wood into elemental carbon?
I think that's a really good question. And I think that whilst, yes, there is the input of pyrogenic carbon into the soil from fires, which is kind of one of the gains that I was talking about in terms of the kind of the carbon fluxes within a system. But also fires within forests can be really important because at the moment there's kind of a focus on sort of fire suppression. We sort of see these wildfires as really negative things, and we don't want anything to be on fire, so we work really hard to suppress it. And actually this can lead to a buildup in dry fuel, and this is where fires are kind of naturally ignited. They can then cause these more intense and extreme wildfires. So actually by implementing kind of prescribed low intensity fires to remove this dead fuel, actually you can also kind of see benefits within forests. So I think that kind of managed fire, particularly within forests, can be a really good strategy for the long term.
And I think some of the evidence of the wildfires that have gone completely out of control is the lack of management, isn't it? And so fire management is so critical in that sense. I have a question from Mr. Dwyer.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, two apologies. I was actually not expecting to ask anything. I was on my Watt bike, which is why I'm wearing a gym kit. The second is I'm not normally so formal as to call myself Mr. Dwyer, but I've just spent two years, which I've just aborted actually, as a teacher, a geography teacher actually, so that's why my Zoom handle appears to be Mr. Dwyer. No, I've got to admit, I find this incredibly interesting for two reasons. The first is that I've now returned to that area, but prior to teaching, I spent sort of 25 years as an energy lawyer, and involved really to a reasonable degree, I suppose, in some of the geopolitics that sits around energy around the world. I then did 2 years in teaching, and I saw the great passion with which people in other generations hold their desire to sort of change the environment. And since coming back into the law, I'm currently a legal consultant for the Asian Development Bank. I've begun to think that the problem is that although there's the requirement and there's the desire to manage the environment, there's the old economic mantra that you can't manage what you can't measure. And some of the work that's being done at the moment that sits around sort of mapping the carbon cycle or elements of the carbon cycle that I'm seeing, I actually think that it could be real step change work around global climate change. Because if it's done to the right scale and it's put on the right platform, for example, it's made available to people on smartphones, if there is a meaningful unit of measurement, perhaps embedded in some form of blockchain for climate, climate credits, as it were, people would actually be meaningfully able to change their behavior with respect to climate. Because at the moment, we can't. And whilst, Rod, I love your ambition with respect to your to the investment, but having been in the city for many, many years, how sure are you that those assets which are currently being called ethical and green will actually turn out to be so? Isn't the real holy grail here for us to do what people like David are doing, which is trying to get some real integrity and measurement into the use of carbon?
David, I'm going to draw you in and then I'll come back to you, Rod, if I may. David, firstly, just to comment on that intervention, and that goes right to the heart of what your center is trying to do, which is to try and bring transparency, because so much of what has been claimed in the past has often been dismissed when you look a bit deeper as what people sometimes call hot air. It's really not worth the paper that the carbon credit is printed on, because it hasn't really resulted in any meaningful change. And I think that's what your intervention is really pointing to, that, how can we have any credibility in these claims? And if we don't, then the planet is on a one-way pathway to getting warmer. So firstly, I think that does resonate precisely with what you're trying to do.
Well, yes, it's music to my ears. Thank you very much.
I thought it might be.
So I guess some game changers are that the space agencies, NASA, European Space Agency in particular, are investing in new technologies for measuring forest structure, at least from space, from which we can work out carbon. So the most amazing piece of technology in space at the moment, in my view, is something called JEDI, G-E-D-I, which is a sort of a bit of a joke from NASA because it's firing lasers. So it's a sort of Star Wars sensor, and it's firing. It's so far fired about 20 billion laser pulses at Earth, and each time it measures forest structure from space. And so that is providing the basis for an accurate map of carbon, and indeed changing carbon in our forests. So that's one game changer. The other one is just the cloud computing and AI advances, which mean previously inaccessibly huge data sets are sitting online, and we don't do what we used to do with sort of taking bits of data and putting them on our laptops and then running our own bits of software to manage them. But everything's being done online now with these amazing new fast computers. We actually use Google Earth Engine, so the power behind Google Maps is one of the products we use a lot. And,
brilliant.
So those are the sort of the big sort of technological changes. And the third one is actually that carbon has a value on global markets all of a sudden, because companies are committed to achieving net zero, and so they are. And we're very strongly of the view that decarbonisation is the most important step that companies need to take, but we recognise that carbon offsetting in nature will also play a role in that. But actually, carbon is now worth a significant amount on these global markets, so it's actually profitable all of a sudden to work in this space for companies, and it becomes attractive. But what we really want to do is is make this process so that small people can work at village scales or small scales and earn money from protecting forests, rather than having large projects which are run by large consultancies or businesses from outside a region, so that we can really help local livelihoods. That's something which we'd really like to achieve.
Rod, this question about how we have measurable indicators was right at the heart of our, conversations around our investment policy transition. How will we know that we're doing better? What are the objective indicators? So, I mean, I think, the question that was asked was kind of saying, how can we put any faith in, these transitions, and what evidence can we use? And I know that the commitments that we've made are about measurable improvement with the best available indicators. So maybe you would have an opportunity to elaborate.
I think you raise a really important point, because at one level, you could be very pessimistic. You could look at the financial crisis and the way that the rating agencies in the financial crisis, not in relation to ESG, but just in relation to normal rating of companies, were, for want of a better word, corrupt. They had moved away from that independence. But I personally am a glass half full person, and I believe that actually what you need to do is you need to be on a journey, and we need to commit. Now, it's not perfect. There are still further steps we need to take. But I think it's actually with institutions and communities like ourselves making that step, the lens through which those investments will be viewed and scrutinized will be quite high. And I think that is about, coming back in a year's time and saying, is the benchmark the correct benchmark, or should we be pushing for a more aggressive benchmark? And hopefully that, together with all those other institutions, Cambridge colleges, Oxford colleges, our voice will have a far greater resonance than actually the tangible investments that we invest in ourselves, basically.
Yeah, I mean, apologies, Rod. I'm not saying it's by any means the wrong thing to do. A little bit jaded. In the last few weeks to start to find out that many governments are getting touchy about polysilicon and solar, because apparently the majority of polysilicon is made in Xinjiang province in China. So there are ethical concerns around solar panels. So I'm just saying that for me, the work that's being done around really democratizing the knowledge about carbon and about what's being used and what's being done is probably, given how useless COP26 has been, is probably going to do. And I just want to congratulate David and others in what they're doing, because I think it's probably going to do more to help the environment, to actually enfranchise people who really want to do it with the knowledge to be able to do it accurately and well, if that makes sense.
And I think that's what's amazing. I mean, if you go back to the sort of the tools that are now available, things like Google Earth Engine are just so powerful and now available for school kids to use if they want to. So there's just going back to your classroom, if you do, the things that a geography teacher can use in their classroom are just kind of generationally different to 30 years ago, which is kind of just amazing. And I think that democratization of information is probably going to feed into the street activism that I celebrate. Let's just close with this intergenerational question, because obviously this is kind of where the young people are driving the agenda in such a powerful way, using knowledge, science, which is now available on their fingertips. So, and as a collegiate community, one of the kind of things that keeps us all alive and excited is the fact that we have new generations of people coming all the time, holding us to account, asking us questions. So I'm going to turn again back to Rosie and Ellie for a final concluding thought about, do you think your voices are being heard in these intergenerational dialogues? Do you think you're getting across to the ones who are calling the shots, or do you feel sometimes that you're shouting into an abyss, nobody's listening? Ellie first, and then Rosie to close.
Oh, that's a really good question, and I think I flip between feeling empowered and heard, and then feeling dejected and kind of as though I'm a small fish in a really, really big pond. But I think that generally, and we kind of discussed this in the other Fitz talk about kind of the pre-COP, essentially that this kind of, I think that this pressure from the grassroots up is actually having a bigger impact at the moment than it ever has done, to my knowledge anyway, in my lifetime. And that this pressure from this new generation is forcing the people who are in positions of power now to act, because we're not being quiet. And it's not enough to just to do a couple of token efforts to keep us quiet. That's not the game that the young generation are playing at the moment. It's very much a consistent won't back down until things change, because it's so hugely important. It's our lives, it's our kids' lives. It's not we're not kind of flippantly looking for trouble. But yeah, sometimes I feel that people are tried to scapegoat out of making real changes, because it is hard.
With any luck, Rosie, you're going to be in the prime of your life in 2050. So this is not some kind of distant future. This is going to be your present very soon. So yeah.
I think sometimes it can, almost feel like you're staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. And I think, it was quite interesting because I had a supervision then where we kind of, as COP was going on, we were discussing a lot of what was coming out of it. And I think the general feel in the room of there was, 3 people my age there kind of discussing what was going on, how it linked to what we were learning about. And I think, there was kind of a general feel of just feeling a bit disheartened. And I think it can be very easy to kind of, if you don't feel like you're being listened to almost lose hope. But to kind of, bring it back to a different type of situation, but one that I was put in La Palma, that was a very, similar situation, in that there was such a huge social element of it. There was a lot of destruction. There was, again, a lot of kind of intergenerational divide on the kind of response to the eruption. So I think for me, when it kind of feels like this is my future, it's my children's future, it's so important to kind of find the small positives. And as Ellie mentioned, a lot of the grassroots schemes, there was a lot of, beautiful things that did come out of COP, kind of those everyday interactions that happened in and outside the centre. And for me, whilst I was in La Palma, it was so kind of easy to get caught up in the emotional side of the eruption, but there were some beautiful things that were going on, every day. We worked with a photographer who, his house had got destroyed by lava flows, and when we tried to give him money, he said, no, I wanted to go to this family, I wanted to go to this charity. So I think, at times it can be quite disheartening, but I think, there are positives out there, and, if it takes a bit harder to find, it is worth finding them.
Thank you. That's a wonderful note to end on, Rosie. And thank you again very much to everyone who's contributed to the conversation. Thank you to the audience for participating. It was a pleasure to see all of you. Do read the Optima. It's a fantastic read, and I think it ends with a note of optimism in Optima. So thank you to everyone who's helped to put it together and for hosting this event. Enjoy the rest of your evening.